anonymizer constantly and in a specific pattern, which most of us have a lot of patterns, then it's possible that the anonymizer guarantees do not work anymore. We saw a talk about this on Tuesday using data mining on traces left anonymously, and you can actually eventually become re-identified. We don't know exactly the consequences of this on anonymizers. But one does usually advise to use anonymizers in short periods, and one could argue that our identities change so fast that this is maybe not a problem, but we don't know. Okay. But basically what I would like to point out is the problem is that we constantly see privacy as an individual issue, and the solutions we give are also about protecting individuals. And maybe we should change our concept and think about collectives. And it's actually, if you look at Tor and a lot of the anonymizers that are out there, not all of them, not the commercial ones that are just a single proxy, it is about collectives. And maybe we need to talk about collectives instead of protecting individuals. It's a community trying to protect a community. This might also help in finding new nodes in relays that are more trustable. Some people will agree that anonymizers and this whole idea of confidentiality fails. I would disagree. In a networked world, it's very important that you can sometimes detach yourself, and these technologies are very important exactly for this purpose. We need to keep them. And for strategic revelation as well. I will not go in detail. So, I mean, when I criticize anonymizers, it should be understood that I want to keep them, but we just need to work on them a lot more, because what is at stake is much higher, and the threats are much higher. Okay, privacy is control. How many minutes do I have? Do you know? 20. Oh, good. Whew. Okay, so privacy is control. So I already told you that it's Weston's idea that you get to control your data after you reveal. A lot of the solutions in this area actually is following up on a tradition which is called identity management systems. The first example, I mean, if you look at it historically, identity management systems follow up on customer relationship management systems, etc., but I'm not going into all of that. The first example that is currently being improved with privacy in mind is Microsoft Passport. So the idea is that you would sign on with Microsoft Passport, and then you could use services, and Microsoft would provide all these services with information about you. This was seen as a grand tragedy. It was shunned, not for privacy, but because Microsoft was locking customers and basically evading competition. All right. So the reaction to Microsoft Passport, which then failed, was Liberty Alliance, so a number of companies that has now become Oasis, said it shouldn't be just Microsoft who does this, we should all be able to do it. So we want the concept of what is called federated identity management. The model is as follows. The idea is that you give the user control while getting rid of the password model. User wants to access a service in a relying party. This is the vocabulary that you find in these documents. It's not my vocabulary, okay? So user wants to access a relying party. Relying party sends a message over the user to the identity provider. Identity provider does the authentication of the user locally and also hopefully authenticates the relying party and sends the information that the relying party wants, prepares it through the user, okay? And because everything goes through the user has control. Okay? In Turkish, we say, if you eat it. Okay, so, all right, so people noticed that this might be a bit problematic if you have one identity provider. So Liberty Alliance and Oasis said, we also want a piece of the cake. We want lots of identity providers. And they said, this is so good for your privacy because now you can put parts of your identity, so your different data bodies can be in different identity providers. Of course, there's no such thing as collusion between identity providers, and law enforcement does not have subpoenas, etc. But okay, this was so good for your privacy. So some of the people from the privacy is confidentiality paradigm said, well, you know, we take the critique on. We need to sometimes reveal data, and we want to have kind of oversight. And this identity provider thing is not bad because we have so many identities, it's so good we can outsource it. So why don't we use some of the credentials we have? So the identity provider gives us the information, so I get whatever credential with my name, birth date, and my legal status. And then What I can do is I can show this to a relying party myself. I can show part of the information. I can actually use zero-knowledge proofs and, just prove whatever I have to prove and not give them the information. I might not, I can just show that I'm above 18 without telling them my name. So what I have done is basically I have unlinkable identities because in every transaction I can use different parts of my transaction. These are not linkable, and I have a system which is not forgeable. Right? So it's, again, these little tricks that Chaum started off with. These are called anonymous transactions. I prefer to call them pseudonymous. You will see in a minute why. And the very basic idea is the identity provider here can no longer profile who the user is communicating with. Does that make sense? Because as you saw here, every time the user goes to a relying party, identity provider is informed. Whereas if you have the selective disclosure credentials, the user gets a bunch of credentials and then shows them little bit by little bit every time he goes to a service provider, right? So you don't have to go back to the identity provider and say, I want to show a credential to somebody. You have your own autonomy a little bit, which is, really nice, and it's a lot of magic. Now, the problem is they want to have a universal model, right? They want this universal identity management to work in any sort of service. There are some problems with that. First of all, let's look at this concept of control. So the kind of control they're offering is very similar to real passports. So what you have is when you want to cross borders these days, it didn't always used to be that way. One country gives you a passport, hopefully, if everything goes well. Another country, if, again, everything goes well, will give you a visa. Then you go to the border, you show them the passport, and hopefully you can go through, right? Now, you can say you have control, but the only control you have is to make the decision, do I want to go across the border today or not, right? You can either decide not to, or you have to carry this passport. That's the first thing. The second thing is, you're not carrying the passport because you really want to. Somebody wants to do border control and they need somebody to carry the information. You're actually like a mule, right, carrying this passport. So I'm not really sure this is the kind of control that I'm very excited about. So what it actually comes down to is that the amount of control I have depends on the power relationship I have with these two parties. So however much they give me control, that's the control I have. I don't have any control over the data. That's something else. The next thing is, of course, there's a power relationship between the identity provider and the relying party. It's not clear or evident that different service providers will want to outsource a lot of this information to identity providers. Some people are very interested. Government is very interested. But we'll come back to that in a second. Anyways, but in the end, identity providers and relying parties have to communicate, which means that they have to have some sort of ontology. And the thing is, who's going to decide what is relevant information and what's exactly, how far do you have to go to give secure credentials, et cetera. So this becomes a power game in itself, because now we get into what is identity, what counts as secure identity, and who's going to decide on that. And again, the user is not in the game here. Thanks. The other thing is, now the relying party has to rely on the identity provider for making security decisions. You can like that or not. Okay, so you want to have a universal identity system, which means that you're not going to be able to use some of the really cool technology if you have a closed circuit, when somebody, for example, uses the credential twice or in an unwanted manner. So what happens now is that if the relying party has the feeling that somebody is frauding or doing something not right, then they want to be able to revoke your anonymity. Right? So they call this, against fraud. ACTA is also against fraud, I think, right? And so, it's against fraud, so they call it the escrow key. And the idea is that, every time you use these credentials, you give part of the escrow key. And if you do something fraudulent, they can walk up to the people who have the escrow key and open up and de-anonymize you. And the good candidate is, governmental organizations or neutral organizations like data protection commissioners. But, are they really capable of keeping these keys? Do they have the security infrastructure for holding such a key? Who would actually be the more likely candidate to hold an escrow key? Maybe some internal national security agency. So that means that we were going to be provided with identity management with lots and lots of privacy, which can be turned off if some agency decides to. And this is called the most privacy-preserving identity management model. So yeah, on-demand de-anonymization. So I would argue that this is a design failure. So the problem is that you want to have a universal identity system. This is being pushed big time right now. We have millions of euros going into this in Europe, in European projects. Governments want it, insurance companies want it, the US wants it, Europe wants it, US wants to be better than Europe. No, I think US doesn't have this problem. Europe wants to be better than US. So, this is a really big industry political move. And basically, because of this universal identity system, it's very easy to construct fraud use cases. And once you construct the fraud use cases, you have an argument for key escrow, right? So it's actually like an argument that produces key escrow. It's really weird. All these really good privacy people are all working on key escrow. I mean, it's really wild. Okay, so, and it dismisses existing solutions, so all the stuff with double spending prevention, blacklisting, without the anonymization, reputation systems, which work with closed systems, are dismissed because you want a universal system. Okay, so basically what is it? We introduce a surveillance system, we call it doing privacy, and we say trust us. Okay, so we put a privacy label on a surveillance system. This is the danger, right? I'm not saying this is definitely happening. This is in the research plans, right? Let's see if they even succeed with identity management. But something is going on here. So what could be done? Well, do we really need 3 parties? Maybe we can just do with 2. It's enough to have 1 power relationship than 2. Or we can put the relying party and the identity provider together. Another option is maybe ask other users to help us in identifying ourselves. Do we really need all these organizations that are going to tell what we are? And I think one of the main problems, again and again, if you remember in the anonymizers, there was this idea that the individual is responsible for taking care of the privacy. Well, here we have in the documents, if you look at these documents, you have this user who's going to control her data from morning till evening. Right? You're going to audit the companies who collect your data. You're going to decide who's going to get which data. You're going to write policies. You're going to see if they did something wrong. You're going to make complaints. And how many times do you, I don't know if any of you use things with privacy settings, but how many times do you go to your privacy settings? Now you have to also do all the auditing. It's a super user they're imagining. And this is a citizen as well that they're imagining. It's a customer that they're imagining. You have all these roles that are being put onto the individual. And they have to be the controller as well. They have to make sure everything with data protection is going well, make sure that the transparency system is working. Basically, the user is responsible. Okay, so this is the model they're creating. This is what it means to control. Okay, last paradigm. I don't have nice pictures because it was like this morning at 7 when I did the slides. And anyway, so the idea is basically, a lot of the privacy stuff, I'm sure you've heard of the argument, you value the stuff you get back for your data more than your privacy. So there's this kind of utility function. What do you get out of giving your data? Some people say, it's not like when we make these decisions, we're only making decisions on economic value. They're actually social influences as well. I'm sure a lot of people in this community have learned from each other what to do with their data, and that we do on a global scale, right? So we have what we call privacy practices, and there's a lot of people from human-computer interaction and privacy design saying, let's make data practices transparent. Let's show each other how we deal with data, and let's hope that through that we can cause more transparency and see what's happening in the current practices and start making claims about how we should collectively change the current practices, right? Sounds like a lot of blah, 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 but it's kind of nice, okay? I think it's nice, okay, whatever. Okay, so the idea is allow users to individually and collectively affect the flows of information. The examples that are given are identity mirror or privacy mirror, so you see how your identity is represented online. If you, for example, do a Google search of yourself, you can see what kind of information is scattered. That is information that goes into your privacy practice, right? So most importantly, individual transparency is not enough. People are now trying to reduce transparency into knowing what you have given a company. If you go to Google Dashboard, you will find all of your data. How exciting. I want to know what they do with this data. I want to know what kind of categories I'm part of, I want to know what other information they have about other people, and maybe I want to use that data as well, right? No, what do you find? You find everything you have given them. In a limited version, of course, but okay. All right, so we need to question this economic thinking. It's not about individual decisions and utility, there's something more. But what can we actually question about these very nice people who are proposing privacy as practice? Users may want to be open to negotiation. We might kind of, collectively introduce very nice practices. But how about service providers and governments? Do they really want to negotiate what our privacy is with us? And who defines what it means to be transparent? Transparency is mostly defined by the people in power, and they decide what it means to be transparent. And which practices will prevail? I mean, wisdom of the crowds, but which wisdom will we get if we develop privacy practices based on majority opinion of what privacy should be? Okay, lessons learned, and then I'm going to stop. So my recommendation